So the 30-second elevator speech is, I started Aardvark when I was 17 years old in rock climbing equipment. Early on, started dealing with tactical teams that would, I felt like I needed to know more about the gear than they did because I didn't want to be a sales guy. And so I learned about the gear at a deep level. And as I started to deal with special ops units and tactical teams, they would ask me to get them additional gear. Can you get this? Can you get us Eagle nylon gear? So I don't know anything about that. Call this guy, get set up, we'll buy it from you. And the business began to evolve that way. And when I got out of college, I went to law school at Loyola in Los Angeles. And I was very lucky because the guys that I hooked into early in the business were the guys that were really the founders of SWAT. It was the guys that were writing all the articles and were developing tactics and were developing the doctrine. And so that coincided with me going to law school. And I was fortunate enough, my last 2 years of law school, to work at LAPD's police litigation unit. So I worked on the Rodney King case and the Reginald Denny case and a bunch of the SIS cases. And this is 93 to 95, right when law enforcement litigation explodes. And so I was writing, I was going to law school, and I was working with tactical teams and had developed this, big experience because I wouldn't turn down free training. And so by the time I got into law school, I had about 3,000 hours of training. I was spending most of my time going to classes and I was very lucky that these guys were as generous with information as they were. So it put me in this weird position where I'm in law school writing about flashbangs and writing about media interference in tactical situations, while at the same time protecting tactical operators on the other side of my world with equipment. And got out of law school and kind of hit the crossroads where I realized that civil litigation outside of the government is mostly settlement of a case. And I was very lucky while I was working at Police Lit to work for a lawyer named Corey Brent, who was a true believer in law enforcement. And Corey defended cases with all of his being and did everything he could to protect the officers. And so when you get out into private civil litigation and realize it's an insurance company that really doesn't care, it was very, very disenfranchising for me. And by then the business had started to do military stuff and it started to really explode. And so I had that conversation with my wife at the dinner table one night, and I've been doing this ever since. But I still maintain my license and still write on legal related topics.
Yeah, and as you said, you must have gotten a tremendous amount of experience being where you were at when you were there. Have you noticed any difference from what it was like back then in the early 90s with litigation and how it's kind of evolved in what we see today?
Yeah, it's interesting. I had two big coincidences. I like to joke I'm tactical Forrest Gump. Like, I have been in the right place at the right time so many times in my career, all of it unintentional. And I think if I had a skill set, it was to recognize that I was at a crossroads and there was opportunity. But when the whole thing started, both the tactical, the evolution of tactical law enforcement starts 71 as LAPD's team becomes full-time, but it's really the 84 Olympics that caused the explosion of tactical teams all over the country and the evolution of tactics. About 10 years later, you have the first lawyers who are making their living suing police departments for their tactical actions, which was Stephen Yagman and Johnny Cochran and the ACLU. And those guys were all suing LAPD at the time. So, on the one hand, I have my clients building law enforcement special tactics and seeing that evolve. And then on the other side of it, I'm watching the plaintiff's bar evolve their tactics and figure out how to sue police departments, how to sue for dog bites, how to sue for high-risk entries. And so it was a really interesting time to be there. And yeah, it's unfortunately the plaintiff's bar has gotten stronger and stronger. And, it's become a full-blown industry now.
Yeah. When I was working at the city attorney's office just a few years ago, I could tell right away that the extremely lucrative to be in the field of suing police departments for the reasons you said. The insurance company gets involved, and a lot of officers don't understand. It's like, why aren't we fighting this? We didn't do anything wrong. Well, there's an insurance company, and the costs are building up, and if we go to trial and they get $1, we got to pay them $1 million in all their fees. My passion came from seeing that, and I can tell you, every case that I was involved with, I would notice a common theme that there was a lack of training for the officers, both maybe in tactics and especially from my perspective, the law. Just, we're spending all these weeks in the law enforcement academy on like how to shoot a gun. They get 1 day of search and seizure. So that kind of drove me to go in to what I do in training law enforcement in the legal aspects. But if I'd ask you, where does your passion come from? How did you kind of got involved with it in law school? Was it something that just sort of happened and you just became more and more passionate about it, or where does that come from?
Yeah, it's interesting. Part of it was because I was growing up, right? Like I started at 17. I'm dealing with tactical claims at 19. I'm growing up around this amazing group of leaders who are engaged in, God's work, right? They are putting themselves in harm's way for people they don't even know, which to me is possibly the greatest thing a human being can do for another human being. Be willing to risk your life to save theirs. And I loved the people that I worked with. And what I didn't understand was being around these teams and the teams training me and spending time with me and, spending time together on the weekends created a culture for my business because I really cared about my end user. And it wasn't a business transaction for me. It was my friends. Yeah, there was business involved, but they created this passion for me of who protects these guys, who protects them, who cares about them. Both from a safety standpoint, from a training standpoint, from a litigation standpoint, like who protects the men and women who put themselves in harm's way. And I think that now looking back, 37 years later, I think that those early relationships created a love for my end user that as the business grew just became our culture. And now I look at the people that I work with and everybody cares about our end user. That is the one rule you cannot violate at Aardvark is you cannot screw the end user. Like you can make bad business decisions and survive. That's fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
but you always focus on the safety of the end user. And fortunately, here I am, almost 4 decades later, still passionate about it, still love it. And that was kind of the genesis for the podcast.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love how you put that. I feel the same way. I've never heard it put that way. Who's looking out for our first responders? Who's looking out for our law enforcement that puts, their life on the line every single day? From my perspective as a prosecutor, and then in the litigation, everyone was against them, especially in the the post George Floyd era. Who is providing this stuff? And that's kind of really. I mean, I've worked in the field for years, but that's why I decided to forego, lucrative private practice and kind of just go into the training aspect. I feel exactly the same way. I love that. Real quick, you mentioned it, the podcast. For those that don't know about it, it's really interesting. And you talk about leadership. You got a lot of people that are really important in the law enforcement community. Tell us a little bit about your podcast and what you do on there.
So I'll give you the backstory. I've been wondering for years, the guys that brought me up are getting old. And some of them have died. Some of them are starting to have cognitive issues. Guys retire, they get hurt. And I found myself asking a lot, like, why are we not capturing this? Why are we not recording the history? Why is there not, a documentary about the evolution of special tactics in the United States and the men and women that drove the evolution of this? And there isn't. There just isn't. There's no recorded history. And I started to realize, like, the stories are dying. Stories are dying with these guys, and the stories matter. The why matters. And, the first generation is the only one that really knows the why. They're the only ones that when they're developing the tactics, they had to figure everything out. So they deeply understand the why. And the why is what keeps you, out of trouble in court. The how is not as important as the why. So a friend of ours, Tim Anderson, got ALS. And we were all standing around at Tim's funeral. And Tim was a Marine 06 and a law enforcement sergeant at LAPD. Had an amazing synthesis of military doctrine and civilian law enforcement. He and another guy, Sid Hale, who was one of my mentors, were really at the forefront of tactical science in law enforcement. And we're standing right at Tim's funeral, and I said, like, do you guys realize how much we lost today? Like, we're never going to recreate the 40 years of experience Tim had in the Marine Corps and 3 wars, and like, we're never going to recover this. And we didn't record any of it. And that started this longer discussion about going out and creating this information. And the reason it ended up being my problem was the realization that law enforcement, you see, law enforcement can't defend themselves, right? They're not in a position to defend themselves, because anytime they interact with the media is not looking for, oh, this was a brave, selfless act by an officer. They're looking for, wow, this is selfish, this is criminal. And so everything that they say can be taken out of context. Everything that they say is recorded. And so the majority of agencies are very uncomfortable, even on good topics, even on good things, about talking to the media for fear it's going to be used against them. And what ultimately flipped the switch for me was a conversation with a friend who runs one of the major metropolitan SWAT teams in the United States. And he goes, look, if you want to do this, you're going to have to do it yourself, because we're not going to talk to anybody else. Mm-hmm. We don't trust them, and we can't trust them. Structurally, we can't trust them. We can't allow them to capture footage of all of these people, talking for 90 minutes about their life-changing events, because somewhere in there will be something that can be cut and used against us. And he said, we trust you. We'll talk to you because we know you won't screw us. And in the end, that was what triggered doing it, was the realization that if I didn't bring on a financial partner, if we didn't have a broadcast station, if we didn't have the news involved, and I owned the footage, we could very carefully control the message that we released and tell these amazing stories in a way that the end user, that the guest and their agency would be comfortable with, but still capture the essence of the things that happened.
Yeah, that's so cool. Technology is so vilified these days, but look at the opportunity that it gives us. Do you know who Gary V is? Gary Vaynerchuk? Yeah. He talks on that all the time. He was kind of, as I started to transition from, trial attorney into starting my own business, took a lot of what he said is really good advice, using the internet, and especially what you said, recording things because it could be lost. And, just that kind of reminds me about what you're saying there. And it's not that hard for the law enforcement community now to bypass the media and, like you said, do it ourselves. Yeah. So what do you guys talk about on there? Are you trying to get some of these great folks in law enforcement and get the stories down and, over time have this big database?
So it's kind of 4 silos is probably the easiest way to describe it. There are a number of interviews that are, what we call leaders and legends, people that were the guys that created, the tactics, and the guys that founded SWAT teams, and the guys that developed the doctrine, and those are historically oriented. We interview modern, contemporary SWAT team leaders. So, one of our early shows was Lee McMillian, who is the current one of 2 lieutenants that currently runs LAPD SWAT. That's an example of kind of a modern leader. We're doing a series of training in tech stuff, which is interviews with people who are using, new training techniques, new technology. We did an interview with 2 guys from Cato who are also lieutenants. Now one's a captain at a local police department, talking about simulation exercises and ways to do decision-making exercises to teach your team critical incident decision-making in a safe environment. And then finally, we're doing what we're calling critical incident reviews. So basically debriefs. And one of the roots for the podcast was we, for 20 some odd years, have done a debrief series. We call it the evening lecture series, where we will bring in a team. We handpick the audience, no phones, no recording devices, no media. And we will bring in a team that had a recent event and sit them down with 100 to 200, other teams and other operators to talk about their event. And we've done that almost since the beginning of Aardvark, because that was a lot of what I learned by going to debriefs. And so we did this debrief series, and that kind of now has grown into this critical incident review, where, last season we did a critical incident review with York County, South Carolina, who had a horrific shootout that ended up with an officer being killed and three others being wounded, two being badly wounded. So talking about that and trying to bring the lessons learned from their event to the end users. Episode 1 of season 2 is going to be one of the guys on the Bataclan raid in Paris, talking about Bataclan and kind of lessons learned. So it's those are kind of the 4 silos, and we vary the content depending on who's available and what we think are interesting interviews.
Awesome. Yeah, I've checked out a little bit what you got, and it's really good stuff. And that's what I love about seeing this day and age. It's not coming from the media, because I know exactly what you're saying. I had a media agency reach out to me. They saw one of my videos on qualified immunity. And my video, all it was doing was explaining what it is and what the case law is. I try to avoid taking political positions. My job is to educate.
Yep.
But they wanted to bring me on to in a debate format to say why I believe qualified immunity is something we need to keep. And I knew that was a trap, and I was like, no one that's going to be watching that show is going to have anything, to do with law enforcement. So I passed on it. I know exactly what you mean, and it's guys like you that's creating this forum for law enforcement. It can be a really beneficial. So I'd encourage everybody to check out your podcast. We're going to leave some links to it when we're done. You mentioned something in there I thought fascinating. You've talked to some people about different training types and styles. What are your thoughts on like reality or scenario-based training, either using kind of role players or like we see a lot of the simulators nowadays?
I think that most tactical decisions are paradigm-based decisions. And, one of the things I learned very early on is that the more paradigms you have, the more accurate your initial application. Right? So I always tell the story about, a rattlesnake. The first guy that found a rattlesnake got bit by the rattlesnake. If he didn't tell anybody, the second guy that found a rattlesnake got bit by a rattlesnake. Because they didn't have a paradigm for rattlesnake. They didn't know what it was. They didn't know how it worked. They didn't know, how to handle it. If he went back and said, hey, I found this thing, it's long, it's cylindrical, it's got diamonds on its back, it makes a weird rattling sound, like don't pick it up because it'll bite you and hurt you really bad. Nobody else got bit, at least not by tampering with the rattlesnake. I think that law enforcement decision-making is based on that, right? It is based on paradigms. The real value of experience is having a more refined paradigm set. Right, it's the old thing. The Inuit had 23 words for snow and ice. We have one. That's because we don't need 23. We need one, and it's for ice cubes that go in your drink, right? At least in California it is. So nice. When you do reality based training, when you do decision making exercises, when you attend debriefs, what you're building is a toolbox, and it's not a toolbox you will directly access. You will not sit and think, oh, I need a paradigm about a long cylindrical thing that rattles. You will see the snake and go, oh, wait a minute. I've heard this before. It's this. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the problems we have right now in law enforcement is we're spending a lot of time training, legal issues, training, personal interaction issues and employee liability issues. And we're not spending the money we need on paradigm-based stuff, not putting them in high stress, stress inoculating them, not giving them an opportunity to do enough reality-based stuff. And the consequence of that is you put people into situations when they haven't been stress inoculated, they've not had the opportunity to do that, and they default to their basics. And their basis might be to freeze. Mm-hmm. And, there have been a lot of recent events where you look down and you're like, well, why didn't the police do something? Well, they didn't do something because they didn't have the stress inoculation and they didn't know what to do. They hadn't been in that circumstance. And I think, what you see when you get into high functioning tactical teams, tier one and 2 military units, those guys have been so stress inoculated and they've been through so many different training iterations and they've had so many malfunctions and problems and doors that didn't open the way they expected and things that failed, that when it happens to them in the field, it's no longer stressful. They can just move through it. So I think the more we can take law enforcement and put them into high stress situations and put them into reality-based training, the better off we prepare them for the unexpected. Because really that's what we're training them for.
Right.
Right. No two, as somebody who's now been through probably 1,000 debriefs of tactical incidents, none of them are the same.
Mm-hmm.
None of them evolve the way you expect them to. And all of them introduce new problems. Like the number of debriefs I've sat through where the team has gotten up and said, our comms stopped working, our weapons malfunctioned, the explosive breach didn't work. It's just sitting like, it's so common that it has a term, right? Everybody talks about Murphy.
Yeah.
And how Murphy is present. Like that's how common variability and unexpected change is in this community. So we need to give you the broadest skill set we possibly can. And you think about it as being a lawyer, the more cases you read, the more you understood the nuances of the law.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I always tell attorneys when I'm working with new attorneys and they're getting ready for trial. I say, first of all, let's come into this understanding that the only thing you can plan for in trial is that nothing will go as planned, right?
Was it Mike Tyson?
Be ready to adapt.
Mike Tyson? Yeah. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Exactly. Yep, you got it. Yeah, that's so interesting. Let me, with your kind of vast experience here, what do you feel is the biggest challenge facing law enforcement today?
I think that law enforcement polices us by consent, right? Like the Constitution sets the limits for law enforcement, but in the end, a constitutional form of government, a representative form of government, is governance by consent. We agree to give up some of our rights in exchange for our safety. And I think the last 8 or 10 years, we have seen an undermining of the legitimacy of government on par with nothing I've ever seen in my career, where we are undermining people's perception of fairness and people's perception of the rule of law and the role of the court. And, I remember watching a politician absolutely character assassinate the FBI. And turning to my kids and saying, that is a horrific thing. There might be bad FBI agents in the same way that there's bad doctors. There's certainly bad lawyers. There's bad cooks at McDonald's, right? So there may be bad FBI agents. The entity itself can't be undermined. We cannot stop believing in our government institutions, because when we do and we become cynical, then that consent, that agreement we have with our government begins to tear at the fabric of our society. And I'm deeply troubled by the way we are seeing our law enforcement and the way that the public is perceiving law enforcement and the courts both. And I think that, in the almost 40 years that I've done this, I've watched this pendulum swing back and forth. It is farther askew than I can ever remember it being. Even post Rodney King was not this far askew. And I think that we need programs like yours, like what we're doing, to provide a different perspective to people. Mm-hmm. Because, it's a good problem to have, but one of the problems that we have in the United States is we're too safe. We're too safe. We're too comfortable. We're too far up the Maslow triangle.
Yeah.
And so it's very easy for us to sit around and say, I don't really like the way that police officer talked to me when he pulled me over. I don't really like the fact that he treated me like a criminal. I don't like how he shined that light in my eyes. And to then become actionary on that and saying, oh, well, let's, I'm going to file a complaint against that officer. And I don't think they should shine a flashlight in my face. And that happens because we're not scared anymore. And so when we're not scared anymore, we lose respect for the people that keep us safe. Yeah. And it's my IT guy put it best. We were having a conversation about IT, and he said, the problem with being an IT guy is if you're really good, nobody even knows you exist.
That's true.
And I think that we, as a country, have kind of forgotten that the blanket of safety and freedom that we sleep under is delivered by people who at 3:00 in the morning are dealing with a guy with a gun under his seat. Mm-hmm. On a lonely country road in Louisiana by themselves with their nearest backup being 20 minutes away. And I think
Yeah.
it's very easy to kind of forget that and
Yeah,
say,
it
well,
is.
I don't really like, and I use the analogy of dogs, right? I don't really like the way this Belgian Malinois growls at me and looks at me. I think we should have more golden retrievers, because golden retrievers are nice to everybody and they're friendly, and that's what we need. The problem is sometimes we need a canine.
Yeah.
And if all we have are golden retrievers, then nobody responds. The situation doesn't get resolved. And there have been recent incidents that people were struck by, and oh my God, this is terrible and it's outlandish and I can't believe they didn't do something. That's the golden retriever, guys. Like, this is what we're choosing because we feel so safe that we want to move past that.
Yeah.
And I think that those are two really dangerous things: undermining the legitimacy of government and not having faith in the people that are protecting us. I think has put us on kind of a dangerous path. But I'm optimistic that we've kind of reached that apex. When the city of San Francisco voted today to allow police departments to kill people with robots,
I saw that.
I am absolutely flabbergasted. I would expect that in Texas.
Yeah.
I would not expect it from San Francisco, who pulling your gun out is a use of force in San Francisco. Yeah. I think what you're seeing, though, is in San Francisco, Seattle, LA to some degree, Portland, the cities that were anti-law enforcement, I think are starting to realize that if you're not friends with your police, you need to be friends with your criminals, and that doesn't really work out.
Yeah, that's like you said, that tears at the social contract, and then it turns into Thunderdome out here after that. And man, I ask a lot of people that, say, what's the number one issue facing law enforcement? And the typical response we get, well, we need more training. They need to have more access to this type of training or legal training at the academy. I agree, that's all important stuff. But what you're saying, I 100% agree with you. That's the pendulum. It swings back and forth. And, I've only been doing this since the early 2000s, but in studying history, you can tell this is just so far out. But I agree. It seems like you're starting to see it get reined in. A lot of politicians are like, oh, defund the police. I didn't say that. Whoa. It's starting to come back now because the crime's getting to be such a problem. And I'll tell you from personal experience, being a prosecutor in a very progressive town, everyone who voted to, we want to give all these rights and everything like that, they're the first people that were at my office wanting to know why the guy that, committed the petty misdemeanor and stole a bike off their porch isn't going to prison for the rest of his life.
Yeah. No, I mean, you saw it in LA where, we have a district attorney who has decided that we're not going to prosecute people. We had a county council that was running around talking about how bad the police were. But when those people were threatened, they hired off-duty law enforcement officers to protect them. And I think we've kind of reached this point where both sides are attacking law enforcement in their own way, undermining, you have the right attacking the legitimacy of the federal agencies, and you have the left attacking the legitimacy of state and local agencies. Yeah. And, the end result of that and the end result of defunding is not going to be something we want. I mean, certainly there are issues in modern law enforcement, and our police officers are not psychologists, and yet we're making them go out and deal with an insane population that is the biggest it's ever been. Yeah. And giving them no additional tools, and then punishing them when they don't have the right tool. And it's like, well, you took a hammer, you needed a saw. It doesn't go pretty. And so I think I do think that there is a conversation to be had about mental health and homelessness and all of those things. But I think that's a conversation with law enforcement, not a conversation at law enforcement.
Exactly. No, you're absolutely right. What's we say, what's the biggest issue facing law enforcement? We're delegitimizing the police and the tearing at the social fabric of the social contract that holds it all together. What's the answer? Well, I think it goes both ways. It's not, a lot of officers, they think police reform is a bad word, and it's this mentality of this is the way we've always done it. Yeah. Both sides, we need the public side. And if we're going to get that trust back, law enforcement's going to have to realize that they're going to have to adjust to new ways, new ways of thinking, investing in different areas of training. You can't just go through and say, well, that's the way we did it in 1994, so that's the way we're just going to keep doing it. I mean, that's the only way that I know that we can kind of get out of this tailspin.
But I think it's kind of like we talked about earlier. I think part of the challenge with law enforcement when they engage with the media is it doesn't go well for them. And so my view of it is part of my responsibility, part of your responsibility are people who understand the machine but are outside of it, is to try to give perspective. Try to bring stories forward, try to bring an understanding forward. It's one thing for law enforcement to stand up and argue for qualified immunity. It's a different thing for an attorney who understands it, who is not in the process of defending law enforcement, to say, wait a second, here's why we want this. And I think that if we're going to really begin to see effective social change, it is going to have to be multidisciplinary. And I think that we do have to get law enforcement, we have to give them a platform where they can safely speak and not constantly be circling the wagons because they're being attacked.
Right.
And part of that is happening, with retired law enforcement coming forward, with podcasts, with, this kind of explosion of multimedia. You are starting to see, an incident happens and there are 4 or 5 different angles taken on it that people can engage. The problem is we've got to get people to climb out of their thought bubble and look at what other people think, because that's really what we've lost. When we've given up conversation and we've gone to shouting at each other, we've lost the ability to really understand other people's perspectives. And that, to me, goes hand in hand with what we previously said. But that's a very dangerous trend. Is I only hang out with people who agree with me. I only talk to people who agree with me, and as a result, everybody agrees with me and everybody else is wrong. Like, you just put yourself in a circle of wagons. Yeah. And you don't even understand the limits to that. And I think that, you look at like the discussion around militarization of law enforcement. And, I don't know if you read Radley Balco's book, The Rise of the Warrior Cop. I agree with 95% of that book. His coverage of constitutional law and the explanation and quartering and the way the Crown handled, the way the colonists viewed it, like, he does a very good job of reciting the history and talking about the evolution of it. He loses me at one point because his solution I don't agree with. But, the problem is that we just stand and scream at each other. Yeah. We don't go, okay, wait, you're right about these 9 things. So let's talk about this other thing and help me understand your perspective and help you understand my perspective so that we can try to find a middle ground. And I do think that the only way that happens is through conversations like this, right? It's exposing people to an understanding. I had several friends who were kind of mildly anti-law enforcement that watched a couple of the episodes of the podcast. And one of them was pretty, like, I'm going to say very anti-law enforcement. and he pulled me aside and he's like, I watched one of your episodes of your podcast because I was just curious what it was like. And it was one of the best tactical leaders in the country that he watched. But he came back and he's like, I had no idea those guys were that smart. I had no idea they cared that much. I had no idea they were that passionate. And I kind of feel stupid for not having ever even thought about it. Yeah. So I think that's where you and I can make a difference.
Absolutely. Well, John, I tell you what, we're at that time where people start to tune us out if we don't start wrapping it up. And I think you gave, I knew it. I knew this was going to be a different perspective. Really glad that we did this. I think there's a lot of value. So hopefully, for those of you that are watching this, share this with your law enforcement friends, with supervisors. I really think we talked about some good stuff. Before I let you go, one more time, tell folks where they can find your podcast. You got a shout out, call to action. The floor
Absolutely.
Is yours.
So it's the debrief.live is the website. It's the Debrief with John Becker. You can find it wherever you get your modern podcast flavor, whether it's Spotify or Apple or YouTube. We are on, I think, about every platform. More platforms than I can name, so that's probably most of them. The website, there's a contact form. I want to hear from people. If you've got ideas for guests, if you've got ideas for topics, if you love the show, hate the show, I would really love to hear your opinion. And you really, this is a passion project for me. It's not monetized. We don't have ads. We don't have sponsors. This is me trying to give back to the community that raised me. And so I definitely want to hear anything and any ideas that people have. So please feel free to reach out.
Absolutely. We're going to leave a link to your podcast and your website and all that good stuff. I'm going to leave it in the description. If you're listening to the podcast, it'll be in there. If you're watching this on YouTube, it's down there. Make sure you check it out. John, thanks again. I really appreciate it. Who knows, maybe some other time, once you get a few more of those episodes done, we'll have you back on here. Because I think I got a whole list of questions I still want to talk to you about. So maybe we'll get you on here some other time. But until then, I really appreciate it. And remind everybody out there, especially in the law enforcement community, stay safe. Remember, every battle is won before it's fought. We'll see you all in the next episode.